Thank you, Secretary Schultz, for that very nice introduction. I should also just say a big thank you to the Secretary for your incredible leadership on this issue of climate and energy, both for the state of California, but also for the country. And you have been a really consistent and credible voice on a common sense approach to this, which I think those of us who spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. wish there were a few more people like you back there. So. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here with you. I just want to thank Stanford and the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center for asking me to join you here at the end of what looks like a great and busy day. You guys have covered quite a bit: renewable energy, energy efficiency, big data, the drought. I thought I would wrap this up a little bit by talking about some of President Obama's climate priorities, to talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. About a year ago at Georgetown University, President Obama laid out his climate action plan on an incredibly hot and muggy Washington, D.C. day. And so with a year's distance from that, it's a good time to be a little reflective on what we've accomplished. And there's also a good reason to be a little optimistic, actually, for all of us that are working to build a cleaner and a safer energy future, one that is ready to meet the challenges of the future. And the reason we can be pretty confident about that is that more and more, we have already been rising to meet the challenges of today. Climate change, we know, is not something that is far off in the distance. It is here. It's affecting our economy. It's affecting our coast. It compromises our safety and our security. It's too big for government or any one nation to tackle alone. And it's too complex for just one approach. But fortunately, you and others like you across the country have never been intimidated by meeting that big challenge. And so academics and scientists have done a great job of working to help us understand the threats that we're facing our planet. And then they provided some of the building blocks for us to develop policies that could help mitigate those threats. State and local leaders have begun to plan for the impacts of these climate impacts, and then demonstrated at the local level how they prepare for them, and how they fund them, and how they get their citizens activated around them. Investors saw an opportunity for activity and growth, and businesses saw a chance to innovate and lead on a clean energy economy future. So we feel pretty heartened about the progress we've made. We can also feel assured, all of us in this room, that we have a president in President Obama who very much understands the seriousness of the threat of climate change, and who spends time every single day thinking about its impacts and thinking about how the nation can be better prepared for them. And I have to tell you that his attention and his thought on this and his focus has had a huge ripple effect across the entire federal government. There are agencies, those whose names you would think are spending a lot of time on climate and energy issues, like the Department of Energy or the EPA. But there are a whole host of other ones whose names might not suggest or come to mind to you as focused on this issue. Places like the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense and the Department of Transportation, who now are spending an inordinate amount of time dealing with the issue of climate change and what it means for their operations, their missions, and the sectors of the economy that they interact most with. I have worked in administrations at both the federal and the state level, and having someone at the top with that much focus and that much energy and that much prioritization around this issue is a big deal, and it's a game changer. And it's resulted in very real progress. Over the last 5 years, American inventors and investors have delivered significant progress in developing and deploying clean energy technologies. Wind and solar energy production has doubled. Our cars and our trucks go a lot further on a gallon of gasoline, saving families a bunch of money at the pump. And in 2012, US carbon pollution fell to its lowest levels in 20 years. The simple fact is that clean energy technology costs are continuing to come down. And these technologies are producing more American energy than ever before, and they're producing more American jobs that cannot be shipped overseas. So it's that kind of progress that tells us that we are moving in the right direction, towards clean energy, towards more efficient cars, towards more efficient homes and businesses. And we've made progress in some other ways as well, some ways that are a little bit harder to quantify. When the president gave his State of the Union speech earlier this year, he talked quite a bit about climate change. And one of the things he said was, the debate is settled. Climate change is a fact. And when our children's children look us in the eye and they want to ask us what we did to leave them a planet that is safer and more stable, with new sources of energy, I want to be able to tell them, yes, we did all we could. And when he spoke this last weekend at UC Irvine's commencement, the president said, we've got to do more. What we're doing now is simply not enough. Now, that call to action can be incredibly powerful, but I want to focus more on the first thing he said in that quote, which is, the debate is settled, climate change is a fact. That he had to say that at all tells you a lot about where we've been, and it speaks a lot about the state of politics in Washington, D.C. right now. We have heard time and time again the tired arguments about that go against the overwhelming judgment of science. And we've seen the tactics that have been used to block any progress on this front, tactics that have largely been directed by some of the country's largest polluters. But now, under the president's leadership and the leadership of the private sector and the leadership of state and local governments and others, we are moving past that. Of course, there will always be some naysayers. There always will be. But for the most part, we have all collectively succeeded in changing the conversation. Instead of focusing on whether climate change is happening or whether human activity is driving that change, we are now focused on how to respond to it and how to effectively transition to a clean energy economy. That doesn't mean that we're always going to agree on the solutions that are out there. Of course we will not. But it does mean that the debates that we can have about this can be more productive ones, and that too is a sign of some progress. That shift to a more productive conversation on these topics is allowing us in the Obama administration to take some really strong steps to curb carbon emissions. Just a few weeks ago, we took a major step forward in protecting public health and welfare when EPA announced its Clean Power Plan, which is a plan that puts new limits on the amount of carbon pollution that existing power plants in this country can pump into the air. Now, as many of you know, we currently put limits on mercury and arsenic and lead and other pollutants, but this country has never set limits on the amount of carbon pollution that these plants can put into the air. And they're a huge emitter. They account for about 40% of the carbon emissions in this country. So we have a big chance in this proposal to make a real impact, and we're really confident that we will. So that brings me to where we are now. We now know that we can have some concrete progress that can be made and that will be made in the future, but we still face enormous challenges. I know that many of you are well aware of those challenges, and many of you in this room have been working for years and years to meet them. Scientists in the room I know have tackled some of the technical challenges. Businesses and investors are continuing to find ways to advance this work while keeping our economy strong. But I want to spend just a minute talking a little bit about how multifaceted this threat of climate change is. Some might dismiss it as a problem for the future and one that doesn't really affect us right now. We all in this room know better than that. Last month, the administration released the third National Climate Assessment, which was the most comprehensive and authoritative report to date on the impacts that the US is experiencing from climate change. And it confirms, again, what many of us here already know, that climate change is already having very real impacts in every region of this country and on key sectors of our economy. We also know that climate change is a public health challenge. The warmer temperatures that are spurred on by carbon pollution can worsen smog and soot and pollen levels and lead to increased asthma attacks and other illnesses. And in fact, these past few decades, the percentage of Americans with asthma has doubled. And climate change is putting those Americans at greater risk of landing in the hospital. By the way, I should mention that EPA's Clean Power Plan that I just talked a bit about holds great promise, actually, in counteracting some of those negative health impacts, both by cutting carbon pollution, but by simultaneously also reducing other air pollutants that can have this impact, but that come from power plants. The numbers show that those other pollutants will be reduced by this proposal from EPA so that fewer kids are having asthma attacks. Almost 150,000 less asthma attacks is what's predicted, and avoiding thousands of premature deaths as well. Of course, in addition to public health, climate change is a huge economic impact as well. Put simply, it is an expensive problem. In 2012 alone, weather disasters in this country cost $110 billion. That is real cost to our cities and our towns, to our businesses, to our transportation systems, to our energy infrastructure. And the impacts of those weather disasters are having devastating effects on local businesses, and in many cases, they're crippling livelihoods. You all have seen this here firsthand in California. As I know was discussed in some previous panels, you're experiencing an historic drought that is costing losses in the billions of dollars throughout the Central Valley and thousands of jobs. And across the West, climate change is resulting in expanded dry seasons, in crop losses, and in really costly wildfires. The impacts of climate change are already also impacting food prices. And the polluters are not the ones who are paying any of those costs. It's the taxpayers and the families and the small businesses that are at the end of that. So it's safe to say that climate change causes a whole host of these challenges, economic ones, public health, safety, and our environment. And as we move forward, we need solutions that bring in all angles of that argument and that engage all sectors. And so as I said earlier, government can't handle that alone. And that's true. But we can, if we do it right, help spur some innovation in the private sector and look at the expertise of the local leaders who are on the front lines of climate change. We can set some broad goals and encourage people to creatively find a way to get there. And we can provide some level of certainty through the regulatory environment that helps target effort and resources and investment to the places that it's needed most. But let me move away a little bit from the challenges of climate change and talk for just a second about the promise of how we all can work together to meet some of those challenges. Because we have seen time and time again in this country that when we set ambitious goals, we meet them. Our businesses meet them, state and local governments meet them, and America is better off because of it. And that is the idea that has driven this proposal from EPA in its Clean Power Plan. California is going to have a different path to a clean energy future than Texas or West Virginia or Michigan. No surprise there. But by setting some common sense goals and giving states the flexibility to find a way to meet them, we are letting state governments do what makes the most sense for them. That might mean some of them will end up shifting their reliance to renewable energy. It might mean some of them will choose to invest in modernizing their existing plants. For some, it might mean that they're going to put more eggs in the energy efficiency basket. Or they may, as California did, set up a market-based system to try to tackle that. And in some places, they will choose to join a multi-state program that already exists. But for many of them, our hunch is that they're going to choose from a combination of those different building blocks and put together a plan that makes the most sense for them. And we're pretty confident that what we'll see out of that are some big changes, changes that we can't even predict right now. Here in California, the new cap-and-trade system to reduce carbon emissions is already enabling a new kind of investment and interest in reforestation and smarter forest management. Companies here want to make sure that our forests absorb enough carbon pollution to offset their emissions. And that kind of incentive is beginning to shift behavior, it's beginning to shift effort, it's beginning to shift investment. And if other states could follow California's model on that front, we could expand these new markets all over the country, allowing greater investment in natural infrastructure. And that could spur some innovation in some other areas as well, places like software that we need to facilitate some of that smarter and faster and cheaper forest management, or in some of the verification services that we could really use to ensure that those forests are actually absorbing enough CO2. Now that's just one example, but it's that kind of innovation that could really happen across many, many sectors. The proven technologies that we have now, the exact thing that gives us some confidence that we can meet these goals, are only going to get better and better from here. Of course, you all know that clean tech investments were incredibly popular with venture capitalists and entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley just a few years ago, and there's been a lot of chatter recently about a declining interest in those areas, partly because of all the uncertainty surrounding the demand for clean energy innovation. The Clean Power Plan that I just described attempts to send a very clear signal and tackle that uncertainty head on. By setting clear targets from Washington for carbon pollution reduction, we are signaling to investors that we're serious, that power utilities are going to have to take real action. And while the final proposal may look very different from what the current one does, it will clearly set carbon pollution targets that states will have to meet. And so all kinds of stakeholders can be sure that there will be a market for a lower carbon, clean energy future. And we're doing our best to try to build those incentives in to spur the private sector towards that kind of innovation. Now, before I move off of the specifics of the climate rule for a second, I want to just talk numbers, because there's a few of them associated with this that would be good for you all to keep in mind. The first is 40%, as I mentioned earlier. That's how much of our yearly carbon pollution comes from the power sector. Now, we have spent a lot of time, both in government and in the private sector, trying to modernize and upgrade things like cars and trucks and buildings and factories. And all of that combined accounts for a little more than half of the carbon pollution of the country each year. So it was a very natural next step for us to turn our attention to the next 40% by focusing on modernizing the power sector. The next number is 30%. And again, that's how much we'll cut carbon emissions by the year 2030 from the power sector, below the levels that existed in 2005. And that is a very big cut from where we are today. 8%, that's how much we project that electricity bills will be reduced in 2030 by increasing the energy efficiency across these states and by reducing demand in some of the electricity systems under the EPA rule. And the big number is $93 billion. That's how much the public health and climate benefits from the standards could be worth by the year 2030. And you don't have to be a mathematician to know that $93 billion far outweighs the estimated cost of these proposals, which are $8.8 billion. There are a few others as well. I already mentioned the 150,000 asthma attacks that we think can be avoided, 6,500 premature deaths that we think can be avoided, and the tens of thousands of jobs that we believe will be created by the innovation that this has created. The key here, though, is that everyone has to get involved. With some cutting-edge technology, some groundbreaking research, and the American spirit, we are confident that we can build a future that meets that challenge. We'll need to build a future, though, that's more resilient, too, because the fact is that carbon pollution has been accumulating in our atmosphere for decades. And even if we take these steps to reduce emissions, we are still going to be continuing to feel the impacts for years and years to come. And we'll see those impacts manifest themselves in different ways, region by region, state by state, community by community. And so at the White House, we are spending a lot of time working with state and local and tribal governments, really to find out from them how the federal government can be a better partner in supporting their works to be more resilient. Your governor, Jerry Brown, is doing his part in leading the way as a member of the President's Task Force on Climate Resilience and Preparedness. We have 26 governors and mayors and county officials and tribal leaders from around the country, most of whom have suffered the misfortune of being on the short end of the stick of some natural disasters, of hurricanes and floods and droughts and wildfires. And they're bringing their experience of what they've learned from those events to give us advice on two fronts. Really how we can, at the federal level, better incentivize their ability to build stronger and smarter and safer. And on the flip side, they are pointing out to us how we in Washington can sometimes get out of the way so that these good ideas at the state and local level can really begin to grow. In addition to the local leaders, though, we're also going to need to rely on some innovation from some other sectors as well to increase our resilience across this country. And back in March, we launched something called the Climate Data Initiative, which was meant to really bring in the private sector to this challenge on resilience. The idea there is to unlock the vast amounts of federal data and science that's available on climate change risks and impacts, and to make it publicly available in a way that the average user and decision makers can really use it and make it applicable to the challenges in front of them. And so our hope is entrepreneurs and researchers and tech innovators and others will take that data that already exists, repackage it in ways that are attractive to those on the outside, and create countless new applications and tools and services and businesses that meet that need. For example, as part of that effort, Google has donated cloud storage space for climate data and more than 50 million hours of high-performance computing with the Google Earth Engine platform to help with drought analysis and coastal resilience. Intel is hosting local hackathons with engineering students and computer science students around the country to develop new software applications and tools. And the folks at Esri are partnering with a dozen communities around the country to create free and open maps and apps that they can use to share with thousands of other communities across the country that are suffering from these same impacts. And those kinds of commitments and contributions from the private sector on this challenge of resilience are invaluable. The federal government can do a part of it, but we really need those folks to meet us. So the bottom line is that we are transitioning to a clean energy economy. We're transitioning to a country that's more resilient than we've been in the past to the impacts of climate change. And we are done listening to the tired old argument that we have to choose between the health of our economy and the health of the environment. We do not have to do that. We can do both, and we are already on our way. And so to continue in the right direction, we need businesses to really stay active and engaged on this front. Here in the US, the strength and the capacity of our private sector is one of our greatest national assets. We have the world's most talented entrepreneurs, the most innovative businesses, the most efficient capital markets. But the truth is, right now, we are underutilizing those assets on this problem. Government can play some role in helping to unleash that private sector capacity by creating some of that market certainty that I talked about before, and try to drive demand towards renewables and energy efficiency and carbon reduction. And that's what the Clean Power Plan does. And we are hopeful that American enterprises and investors and businesses around this country will respond. The climate challenge we face, as I said before, is going to need an all-hands-on-deck approach. And so we at the White House are asking for all of you to help us out in that effort. We need the best possible research and science to help us stay on top of this evolving threat to our country. And we need leaders who see opportunity rather than a threat in that reality. But first, we need something much more simple. We need your feedback. I encourage all of you to take a hard look at the plan that EPA put out a few weeks back. It's only about 650 pages, so it's kind of like your favorite summer novel, and you can head to the beach and take a good read. But the plan will be open for public comment for about the next 4 months, and then we will continue to engage stakeholders through the rest of the year in order to make sure that this final proposal next June is as robust and as flexible as possible. I recommend that all of you work with your state and local leaders now to help inform them about how to scope out that full range of possibilities. Each state will be different, and whether it's in California or elsewhere, they all need your help and your colleagues' help in trying to craft what mix makes the most sense for them. And wherever you operate, if you interact with the power sector, you should be talking to state leaders and local officials and other decision makers to help them understand the options in front of them and the business case for carbon reduction and the investment in renewables and efficiency. The President has made clear that we have a moral obligation to solving this problem, that we should not be leaving behind for our kids and their kids a planet that is more polluted and damaged than the one that we inherited. We owe our children more than that. And we, across the administration, look forward to working with all of you to try to bring this country towards a healthier and safer and more resilient place. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank you for all of the active engagement you've had on this issue for the last number of years. And I want to thank you in advance for what I hope is your continued effort and pragmatism as we move through this over the next months and years. So thank you.
We'll have some questions for Mr. Boots. I can't see because of those lights in your eyes. Can't you do something about those lights? They blind us.
Tom Faust.
Does there anybody who wants to ask a question?
Yeah.
There's one.
My name is Tom Faust. My question has to do with Federal Finance Housing Administration that controls billions of mortgages throughout the country. I wrote a letter to the administrator, and I believe it was in February, that President Obama had appointed and recommended that they require as a component that all loans have solar as a component to turn buildings into net zero energy buildings.
Yep.
My response was a one-sentence letter. We received your letter. I think President Obama ordered all the military bases to have solar, and I believe Solar City won that. Was a major.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, why isn't he doing anything with the Federal Financing Housing Administration? He could do it nationwide. That would create over 1 million jobs, and that would. He said he would do administrative orders. So why isn't he doing it?
So the quick answer to that, first of all, he nominated someone for that position, and it took the Congress a heck of a long time to confirm that person. We didn't have a leader in there for quite some time. However, the answer to your question is that we are doing as much as we can administratively on that front, but when it comes to mortgages and the way that we regulate that in this country, Congress has a big, big play in that, more so than what he can do on military bases in some cases. And so we are hampered by the inability of folks in Congress to meet us halfway on that, quite frankly. And we are continuing to push it. There are programs within the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense and within the Department of Housing and Urban Development and at the Federal Housing Administration that we're trying very hard to align and move forward with that priority, but we need Congress to help us out on that front. And I'm sorry that your letter was so short.
I'm Ripu Malhotra from SRI International. You mentioned the 40% and the 30%. So when I multiply those two and I multiply that by the 12%, which is the US contribution that we are controlling here, come to about 2%. Clearly, just doing inside the US isn't going to get it, and you know it. And you're doing the best you can under the circumstances, whatever could be done. So what can be done to engage the other countries to do that? Is this leadership? If you just reduce it by 2%, you're not going to affect the global climate change that we are talking about. And that's all its repercussions are going to happen. We talked about the 5,000, was it 5,300 deaths?
5,500, yeah.
5,500 deaths. Well, I presume that's an annual number?
Yeah.
Globally now, there are 15,000 children under the age of 5 dying every day from energy poverty. So it's the moral obligation is also to provide affordable, adequate energy for everybody to lead healthy, productive lives. How do we balance that is the bigger challenge. Thank you.
I'm sorry I'm not a mathematician. I don't know that I agree with your math on that. But regardless, we have two things on this front that I would say. One, the world got used to the United States not being a leader on this front and not taking action. And so the president feels very, very strongly that we need to do as much as we can on the domestic front to send a strong signal before we ask others to do the same. And quite frankly, the federal government hadn't been doing that. And so this climate plan that he put out last June is an aggressive path with all the agencies across the federal government engaged in trying to move us on that front. We think that strengthens our hand when we go to the international negotiations to show that this country is getting more serious to tackle that problem. Sure, we have more to do. It would be great to be more aggressive in some of those places. The president believes we have laid out a really strong plan. And again, you're exactly right. The plan that we put out last year is about the administrative actions we can take. We would love for Congress to meet us in this effort. But whether they do or not, we have a plan to kind of move forward on both the climate resilience and preparedness front and the carbon pollution reduction side. That's one part of the answer. The second part is that the third part of that climate plan was around the US playing a role on the international stage. And so we, again, needed what EPA did a few weeks ago to be a base for some of those discussions heading to Paris in 2015. And in the meantime, we are also using some of the president's voice and some of the president's time to really be pushing bilaterally with those countries that we need to move towards that direction. And so he has spent a lot of time with the leaders of China and India and Brazil and others to try to make sure that as we head towards 2015, that they are understanding the commitments he's made and that we are encouraging them to follow with us.
Anybody else?
Yes.
I'm John Rosenblum. You mentioned in the Climate Data Initiative that you were going to unlock federal data for, quote, average user. What happens to an unaverage user, and what data are you going to release? Or are we all going to have to use whatever Google or Intel release to us?
So my point in that was that there is a vast amount of data and information that the federal government produces on the Department of Defense creates and analyzes, or gathers and analyzes for its mission. NOAA gathers a whole bunch of information from buoys and monitors around the world, from satellites that NASA and others see. The U.S. Geological Survey gathers around land and natural resource systems. Right now, some of that data is publicly available. Some of it is not. And so one of the things we'd love to do is unlock as much of that as we can, because we think having more information is useful in most cases. However, the federal government is not always great at putting that in a form that people can use, whether it's the average user, the unaverage user, or the decision maker at the state or local level, or in a business that's trying to make decisions. Our idea when we brought these folks together around this climate resilience effort was we need folks who are making decisions in light of sea level rise or droughts or flooding or the next storm about where to site that next road, or where to invest in that piece of energy infrastructure that they know they want to put somewhere in that community, or where to place their evacuation routes. Right now, they're telling us time and again, and these governors and mayors and tribal leaders that I'm meeting with through this task force are saying, we have access to some of your information, but we can't make sense of it. So please help us put this in a form that's consumable and actionable for us. So again, the federal government can do some of that, but again, that's not necessarily the strength of the federal government. And so we are trying to bring in the private sector, those who deal in information every day, to try to help us translate that into tools that people can use.
Here's a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much for an excellent talk. My name is Rick Rowe. Can you shed any light on the probability that Prime Minister Tony Abbott will be able to take climate change off the G20 summit agenda this November this year?
I can't, unfortunately. There's been a lot of change in that country around that agenda, and we are very focused, I will say, at the State Department and across the administration, those that are dealing in all of the worries that the Secretary did when he was in that job, about how we influence other countries to move forward on this front. And like in our system, there are elections, and so some of that changes as we go through it. But we feel we're on a good trajectory towards the discussions in Paris in 2015. We need to up the level of ambition across the countries. And again, just to get back to the earlier point, our hope, the president spent some time with him earlier this week or late last week, our hope is that our example of taking that seriously in this country can help encourage the way for some others to walk that road as well.
Could I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Why don't you sit down with the Chinese? The president had a shirt sleeve summit meeting with President Xi and say, look, you are the biggest polluter. We are the biggest per capita polluter. So let's get together on this. Let's make a deal to deal with intellectual property so we don't have to squabble about that. And let's not worry about what we're going to do by 2050. Let's worry about what we do today. And we'll put into effect anything that looks promising. And we'll give you all the information about stuff here, you do here. You have shale. You don't seem to know how to get at it. Everybody says that at first, but maybe we can help you get at it. And we'll do things. And if people in other countries see that we're actually doing things that are beginning to work, they say, how about me? So come on in. Water's fine. And more countries would come in. And then gradually you build something from the bottom up. I think these big negotiations, I've been in them, of 180 countries, forget it. It's not going to work. It's not going to get anywhere. But if you can actually have some key countries do things that work, others want to join in. And then once you get enough countries, you can have a big meeting that fixes it and you agree.
So that's kind of the path we're on. As I said, we have a commitment to be a part of that big international process, whether it works or not, to your point.
Well, it hasn't worked.
At the same time, we are spending a lot of time, and the president is spending a lot of time, in one-on-one bilateral conversations with China and India and Brazil and a few others. And we are having that conversation that you described.
Glad to hear it.
And we are sending the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, to China to have that conversation with her colleagues. We are sending the Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, to China to have that conversation. And so that kind of out of the spotlight information exchange about the real problems that these countries are facing outside of that big international discussion has, at least in the last few years, been a very productive place to start. It helps to have the president engage with his counterpart at that level, but it also, we're seeing a lot of fertile ground by having the cabinet engage with their counterparts as well. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned fracking. One of the big carbon emitters these days is the flaring of natural gas, and I'm wondering if the EPA has authority under 111D to do something about that?
I don't know that they have authority under 111D, but they, part of the climate action plan was an effort around methane. And so not too many months ago, EPA and the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy and others released a plan on how to tackle that problem. And there's a role for many of them when it comes to methane from landfill and agriculture and a whole bunch of other sources. And so they have laid out a pretty aggressive set of actions over the next year. I don't think they're relying on 111D for that, but we felt strongly that, as you all know, methane is a very powerful pollutant itself, and while we're taking all this work on carbon, we needed to have a strategy on the methane side as well. Yeah. It's hard to see these guys.
Hi, Sam Borgeson. I'd say the two defining features in my mind of the EPA proposal are differentiated responsibilities state by state and flexibility with respect to implementation. And this is a question about flexibility. So I think we've seen in some market-based approaches that sometimes flexibility can have a downside where you may be substituting less reliable mitigation and less innovative mitigation for more reliable and more innovative mitigation. I'm curious how you think about the trade-off between being flexible but the possibility of creating loopholes or the possibility of creating weaker incentives for things like innovation as you try to structure something that people find acceptable and implementable, but at the same time that needs to actually bind in some durable way over time.
I think you're right that those are the two big components of this proposal. What I've been saying to folks as we've talked about this during the last few weeks is that the answers to a lot of those questions are really challenging. And we don't have all the answers to them yet, because the reality is this is the first time we're doing this. We have some lessons from previous kinds of programs like you described. There are those trade-offs. And we have some examples of what folks, for example, here in California have done, what folks in New England have done to tackle this problem. But the reality is most of the country between California and New England is very different when it comes to the power sector. And so the sort of impetus behind what EPA put together was a plan that both allowed that differentiation, necessarily so, and built-in flexibility so that we could ensure that there were enough people building something that made the most sense for them. Now, you're right, that holds some risk. And our expectation is over the next 4 months during this public comment period, people will illuminate that risk very clearly for us so that we can see from all sides how that risk stacks up for different constituents. And I think we'll make a more informed call 4 months from now than we would have 4 months ago about which of those risks is most tolerable. But the reality for us is that this is the first time we're doing this, and yet we want this to be a durable path. So we've got to create something that holds some promise that states across the nation, not just in California and New England, can meet. And we're mindful of the trade-offs of that, but at the end of the day, we want to have something that works. And so, again, for those of you that are sort of way in the middle of the power sector or have some insight into that, this is the time to be really illustrating for us what those risks are from your perspective, because I think we'll see that. We'll get those views from all sides, and it will be incredibly helpful to the administration to be able to weigh those differences.
Last question.
Back to the diplomacy front for a moment. You said that some of the president's one-on-one discussions with foreign leaders had been productive. I wonder if you could give any examples.
Well, I will say, I mean, on the conversations that the Secretary mentioned with the Chinese, there was an agreement on reductions in HFCs. And that is something that both we were planning to advance here domestically. It was not something we had seen China sort of take a lot of action on, but through a few meetings, we were able to come up with some commitment to jointly go down a path of doing that. And we think that holds a lot of promise, actually. If we can get those two leaders together to tackle a problem that has big impacts, that builds a good foundation for some tougher asks down the road. And so it's that kind of an agreement that we hope we can do more of.
Thank you, Mike, for a terrific speech and answering questions right on the nose.
You're welcome.
Thank you.